like a good moment to start. Actually, let me get up so that you can see and hear me. Very quickly, just for introductions. My name is Tarik, Cyril, Amar, and I teach Russian, Ukrainian, and Soviet history at the history department here at Columbia. We have, as you know, a panel dedicated to the theme of the near abroad, a very peculiar and important notion in Russian discourse, and that has strong effects in reality. We have three distinguished panelists, and I will introduce them very, very quickly so that most of the time is left for them to make their presentations, and then also for having a Q&A with all of you, and among the panelists, of course, a discussion. If we start from my right, as it were, we have Gerard Toal, who is a professor of government and international affairs in the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech's campus in the Washington region. He is the author of numerous books. I won't mention them all. They have in common that they are concerned, I think it's fair to say, with an overlap of culture, politics, geography, the issue of geopolitics, in particular the approach of critical geopolitics as well, and I think you might have something to say too about that. His latest book, of course, is the book that is part of our discussion today, Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the Contest for Ukraine and the Caucasus, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. Right next to him, in the middle of the panel, is Constantine Pleshakov, formerly a foreign policy analyst at the Institute of US and Canada Studies in Moscow, now at Amherst College. Again, he has multiple publications, important publications, but to keep it short, I restrict myself to mentioning his latest book, which is the one that is part of our discussion here as well. The Crimean Nexus, Putin's War and the Clash of Civilizations. And right next to me is Serhiy Kudelia. He is a political scientist based now at Baylor University, who specializes in political violence and institutional development. He has produced multiple articles. He has co-authored an important book. He has recently done, I think it is fair to say, extremely important research, in particular on the, whatever is the precise term one should use, separatist rebel areas in the east of Ukraine. He is going to comment after our first two speakers are going to present aspects of the work and whatever they find they want to point out. After Serhiy Kudelia's comment, we will then immediately open up the whole thing to a general Q&A. That, of course, doesn't exclude that the panelists also will respond within that framework to each other if they so wish. I should mention a few points. Copies of the books that we are discussing tonight are actually available. They're over there. There will be a recording of this event. And if I may ask you, I'm sure most of you have already done so, but it would be best if you all turned off our cell phones. Thank you very much, and I think the floor is all yours, Gerard.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much to you and to Columbia University for bringing us together for this discussion. I have been given 15 minutes, 5 slides, 3 minutes a slide, which is quite a task. Let me very briefly sort of give you a general sense of the book and the particular arguments. So the book is an attempt to try to think very, very critically about how we approach territorial conflicts and how we approach geopolitical clashes. It takes a sort of ethnographic approach, so it is looking at the discourse that discursive practices that are used by the players in a particular conflict, and then seeing that as part of the conflict. So there's a move of ethnographic distancing that goes on initially, and also then there's the book throughout draws upon literary criticism. So critical geopolitics is in part an attempt to make strange the particular policy discourse that we use in order to think about and conceptualize conflicts. And so it's very academic in that way. There's a sort of meta quality to it. My own positionality here is I am a generalist. I am not an area expert. I don't have the language skills that the great majority of you have. So I am looking at this from kind of the perspective of larger kind of patterns. My previous book was on Bosnia and conflict there. Thirdly, the perspective is one of critical geopolitics. In the book, I use three different kind of thinking tools: idea of a geopolitical culture, of geopolitical fields, and a geopolitical condition. The larger theme is one of territorial conflict, and it's in part, and this is what I did also in the case of Bosnia, it's about localizing the factors which are crucial to understanding territorial conflicts. That doesn't mean that the local determines, it means that there's a localized quality to what goes on, so that when we think of geopolitics, we normally think of great powers acting, and determination is Washington, Moscow, Kiev, and we use the city as a kind of a stand-in for what we consider to be a homogeneous actor. That's part of the discourse. So I want to look at the what's going on the ground and the complexity of that. So it's about, I'm using this term, thick spatiality, and what I mean by that, it's not the macro, it's not macro, it's not kind of international, national, local. It's more complicated than that. It's about connectivities, and it's about the kind of the forces that make places and unmake them. And lastly, the book is organized around eventful processes. 2 invasions. The invasion of Georgia in 2008, August 2008 war, and then the invasion of Ukraine, 2 aspects to it, in 2014, the first in Crimea, and then in eastern Ukraine. Now, that term invasion in and of itself is part of what I look at and try to deconstruct and move us towards a more complicated understanding. Lastly, one kind of central theme throughout it is what I've called affective geopolitics. It's not something that's particularly new, or it's not a new coinage, but I'm trying to tilt our understanding of what geopolitics is so we take into consideration factors other than what we normally take into consideration when we talk about geopolitics. What are those factors? So, the particular emotional beliefs and the particular emotional worlds of the protagonists. So I use feminist research on gender. There's a lot of this, there's consideration of masculinity in the book, and I'm drawing in particular in this work on some terrific work that has been done in diplomatic history. Frank Castiglione's work, Roosevelt's Lost Alliances. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but certainly there's a lot of really tremendous work done by diplomatic historians on their gendered processes and the kind of the dimensions of that and how that affects decision making and so on and so forth. Then I want to talk about the larger affective structures within geopolitical cultures, the particular understandings that a state has and a state's culture has of its role in the world, who are its allies, aspirations, and so on and so forth, and also their torn quality of a certain geopolitical cultures. Thirdly, there's a consideration of affective space and territories, and that's what I mean by that, and this in part comes out of my research in the Balkans, but more generally, the ways in which certain territories and certain places take on outsized meaning and significance and generate passion on the part of protagonists. So Kosovo, an old Kosovo myth and how that was really central to the wars in the Balkans, and then Crimea. My colleague here, Constantine, talks about Crimea as a fetish in his work, and that's sort of at the same idea. But what I also want to draw your attention to is that places that are relatively insignificant, like South Ossetia, can also take on the qualities outsized significance, because they're seen as sort of places that the state has to demonstrate its credibility, or there are certain ways in which, by virtue of what's happening, the eventful processes that are occurring, these places take on outsized meaning. And then lastly, I want to talk about events as melodramatic stories. And here I will kind of point you to some readings books that have inspired me after I finished Near Abroad, and I thought, wow, I really wish I could have been able to include that. Gregory Carlton's book, which Sophia Pinkham put together and did a really nice review with Near Abroad in the New Republic recently. That's a terrific book, and I'm really, really enjoying reading that. Walter McDougall's book, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who was at the University of Pennsylvania. His latest book is The Tragedy of U.S. Foreign Policy. In both of these books, they use the term civic religion or civil religion. And McDougall's book is a consideration of the power of that in U.S., what I would call geopolitical culture. You read those two books together and the similarities jump out at you. About providential location, exceptionalist identity, salvational mission that the state has of it, and then the victim-hero role. And I'll talk about that in talking about another book which is really, really terrific, which is Elizabeth Anker's book, Orgies of Feeling, which is really on the United States and 9/11 and how that was narrated and understood and what happened subsequently, why 9/11 led to the Iraq War. And what she draws our attention to, this is where the literary criticism, film studies in part informs the critical geopolitical reading that I want to develop. She isolates melodrama as a kind of really central way in which crises are narrated in our culture. I mentioned that in the book a little bit, but what she does is pull it out a lot more explicitly. So an innocent, victimized, intense emotional spectacle, and then rescue and freedom. So there is a consideration, one of the themes that runs through Near Abroad is this idea of rescue and great states needing to rescue territories and clients which are in trouble. The argument overall is against what I'm calling thin geopolitics, and in particular the ways in which thin geopolitics is essentially morally binary geopolitics, which is not attentive to place and the difference that place makes. So it's geopolitical constructions of the world which are in moral categories first and foremost, and which tend to generate very binary understandings of the world. And there's three in particular that I have issue with in the book: occupied territory, sphere of influence, free world. And I argue that these particular categories are inadequate in terms of understanding the particular crises that we see in front of us. And I'm arguing for a thick geopolitics, which takes into consideration contested geopolitical fields, completing power structures, and clashing geopolitical cultures, and then gives us not a realist reading, but a reading where we lay bare the moral complexities involved in these particular crises and have to work through those and do hard work empirically in order to come up with positions and readings of what it is that is going on when we have a crisis like we see in U.S., Russian, or more generally West versus Russian relations today. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Constantine, please.
Thank you. I thought of the book as a potential invitation to a journey. What kind of journey? Let's start with cheerful and pleasant part of it. First, the physicality of Crimea, that strangely shaped peninsula, variously compared to an eagle, to a leaf of a grapevine, or to a stingray. A fascinating combination of three very different landscapes: the steppes, the mountains, and the coast, the littoral. Then all the waves of peoples, settlers, who moved in from the north and from the south. Some of them stayed, some of them left. The north. You know that Crimea sits right to the south of that ginormous Trans-Eurasian corridor, right, east to west. So each nomadic group traveling east to west was tempted to check it out. Many stayed. Every major maritime power of the Mediterranean, or every major seafaring nation of the Mediterranean, checked it out too, used it. Many of them stayed. Why? Well, Crimea is central to Eurasia. If you think about the traditional transcontinental trade route, what we misnamed Silk Road, right? What actually Silk Roads, as Frank Capin says in his wonderful book. So, Silk Road, right? Marco Polo, on his way east, of course he stopped in Crimea. It was kind of a mud room of Mediterranean, a trade post. That's where you assembled the goods that were to go north and east, and vice versa. And of course, you know, those goods at various times included different things. Used to be slaves, now it's oil and gas, among other things. Okay, the physical, well, what all those peoples, right? Greeks, Romans, Armenians, Jews, their legacy, their material legacy is still there. Not much is left after all the wars. But still now and then you can still, in Crimea, you can come across a perfectly preserved traditional Greek village, street or two, an Armenian church, ruins of several Genoese castles modeled after famous castles of Liguria. Of course, all those people, well, not all of them, but from many of them, words, texts also are still here. They survived in different form. Just very quickly going through the I'm sorry. Very quickly, you know, the past 2 centuries, the legacy is amazing. For Eastern European romantics, for example, for Russians, Pushkin, for Poles, Mickiewicz, right? Crimea was the place where they reimagined, reinvented mountains, sea, beach, rock, stuff like that. Okay, we do know that our fascination with going to the beach is very recent, right? Right. What is any beach? You know, we have to think about it objectively. It's a dirty, unhealthy place, right? Staying there could be really, really bad for your health, right? And that's how normal people viewed the beach in normal ages, right? Okay. The sea, dangerous, ugly, right? Stay away from it. A mountain or a rock in the mountains. Well, you can build a castle there and hide there, right? Or build a fortress and intimidate your enemies. But then, you know, the romantics came. Ah, the mountains, right? You know, the sea, the clouds, the ocean, a complete different set of emotions and interpretations. Crimea, very central in all that. Moving on, mid-19th century. Tolstoy, the Sevastopol sketches. I'm sure many of you know of the book. I hope you did not open it, because it's one of the most boring or premeditated texts by Tolstoy. Why? He planned it as a bestseller, as a political bestseller. Check his diaries. He fought in the Crimean War. Fought, okay. Well, okay, you know, officers did not fight in those wars the way they fight now, right? Okay. So, and check his diaries. His main obsession is, to become rich. Why? Because, you know, he was losing too much playing cards, right? Even for a man of his, you know, wealth. Become famous or found a new religion. Well, the Sevastopol sketches, they were published chapter by chapter, and the then Russian Tsar, Alexander II, immediately saw the propaganda value. He had then translated into French and distributed in Europe. So, Tolstoy on RT. Russia Today. Then of course, there is Chekhov, Lady with the Dog. Then a whole constellation of poems by Joseph Brodsky set in Crimea. Okay, when authors die, they become defenseless, and their stories, their words get exploited in many, many myths. Just one example, the most outrageous one. Do you still remember a Ukrainian politician, Yulia Tymoshenko? A fascinating character, you know, particularly, you know, with that hairdo, you know, when she has the time, you know, to put it on, right? Like 10 years ago or something, she was a good friend, partner in crime, perhaps, with Vladimir Putin. Okay, oil, gas, and they met in Yalta. Both were prime ministers, I think, at that point. And they had, you know, lovely discussion, and then they were leaving for a one-on-one dinner. And when the reporters asked Putin, so, what are you going to be talking with Madame Tymoshenko about? He said, oh, we'll discuss Chekhov. The guy has no shame, right? Absolutely. Well, enough of those, you know, kind of uplifting or whatever stories. Okay, another journey I suggested readers of my book took was of another kind, not of a pleasant kind, actually mad ennui. First, it's the story of the resurrection of Russian imperial paradigm, discourse, madness, call it whatever you want. Hand in hand with that comes, as what I see as a cyclical nature of the development of Russian society and politics. Oppression, reform, sometimes revolution, then counter-revolution, oppression, then reform, and so on and so forth. So now we're again stuck in that cycle, and some of us are really surprised. So what's going on? Russians used to be so, warm and fluffy only 20 years ago. Okay. And incidentally, an important point. Every second article about Russia these days published in the media in this country discusses Russia after Putin. Okay, hold your expectations low. After Putin, Russia will become milder, friendlier, more open to the world. But it does not look like that the cycle is not going to repeat itself. So, Russia is there, it's a reality. Putin is not a Lord Voldemort, okay? Live with it, deal with it, so on and so forth. And second, well, another unpleasant journey, right, is, the story of this very interesting digression in US foreign policy of the past 25, 27 years, basically starting with Bill Clinton. Well, the Cold War ended, and after that, exporting values, changing foreign regimes, nation building overseas, engaging in foreign war without any end plan, treating military alliances like NATO as Salvation Army or any other charity. Well, we're all familiar with we all know the crisis that has been going on since then. Ukraine is part of that general misfortune, chaos. I hope we can talk about it later. Luckily, again, rather by good luck than by good management, Ukraine did not see as many casualties and as much devastation as less fortunate countries like Syria, Afghanistan, even Pakistan, Yemen, and so on and so forth. What looks really disturbing to me now, as when Tarik was introducing me, he called me a former foreign policy analyst. Yes, I am a former foreign policy analyst, but still old habits die hard, right? And I'm looking for rationality in U.S. foreign policy. U.S. has been my country for 20 years. I'm thinking about the world my kids will be inheriting from me. I don't like it. The world, I like my kids kind of, what really bothers me is that in U.S. foreign policy establishment, doesn't matter Republican, Democrat, whatever, there is some kind of unholy alliance between neoconservatives and humanitarian interventionists. A very interesting merger, if you can. Doesn't matter where you come from, right? Why you are doing this. The idea is to go overseas, rush, something there, some kind of operation. Operate immediately, or the patient will die. Okay? And then you realize that there was no plan. And forget about, thinking about the consequences of the game. So, my major, the main reason why I wrote the book was that I was very angry at the U.S. foreign policy makers, and my main ambition was that, that there are few people who will ever buy the book, and there are even fewer number that will read it to the end, may possibly reconsider the values of old-fashioned realpolitik. That's all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And of course, I didn't mean you're a former analyst, formerly in Moscow. That's Serhiy, please.
No, I like this, that kind of, ads, some clouds, like a former ambassador.
All right, well, thank you, Tarik, for organizing this, and thank you, everyone, for coming to this panel. I will start with contrasting and comparing the arguments of these two books, which are fascinating books. And actually, I think Serhiy said it's some people will not read it to the end. Once you start reading it, it's difficult to put it down. So
yeah.
highly recommended. And I will also point to some of the differences in the arguments of these two authors. But forgive me, Gerard, I will probably spend more time discussing the book by Constantine, partially because of Constantine's Ukrainian connection, and he speaks about this Ukrainian connection in a humorous manner in his book, and the focus on Crimea, which interests me a lot, but also because I wrote a very detailed review of Gerard's book in the journal Counterpoint, so this is my chance really to dig into Constantine's work. The defining events that explain the annexation of Crimea and the rise of the outbreak of armed conflict in Donbass for both of the authors are the dissolution of the Soviet Union and also the decision by the Clinton administration to start NATO enlargement into the East. This, of course, is a typical realist framework, and I think Constantine falls into this neo-realist analysis that we know about from Mearsheimer's work. He really stresses the significance of security concerns that Russian leaders had in 2014 over the future of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea, and he explains the strategic significance of Crimea for Russia. But Gerard actually moves a little further than just the simple neo-realistic argument, although there is, of course, nothing simple about this argument. He takes rather a constructivist view, where he argues that neo-realistic calculations themselves are an outcome of Russia's geopolitical culture, which is based on this distrustful, perennially suspicious attitude towards the Western leaders, and it's also infused with the specific ideas about Russia's role in its neighborhood and the specific historical myths that it shares and cultural traditions that it shares with its neighbors. So he argues about, he uses this term effective geopolitics, and by effective he explains he means something more than just pure emotion. And he argues that the decision to annex Crimea was not just the result of this response to secure the Black Sea Fleet, but a desire to rescue Crimea, right? And this framework of rescuing Crimea from potential attacks by the far-right neo-fascist forces that were imagined, of course, mostly imagined on Russian television. That's what explains this emotional outburst in Crimea itself. But while Gerard describes effective geopolitics from the standpoint of the analysis of the statements and speeches of political leaders, Constantine actually uses some of the effective geopolitical analysis in his book, and some of his passages in the book actually read like effective storytelling. Partially, it's the result of course, Constantine's personal relationship to Crimea. He was born in Yalta. He spent some of his time in Crimea. And you clearly see that, in a good way, Constantine really cares about Crimea. I was particularly, had a personal connection to me when he was thinking back about this sense of joy that you feel when you cross Perikop and enter Crimea. And I, as a child, spent a lot of most of the 90s, the summer in the 1980s, I spent in Crimea, and I remember this feeling exactly. So it was a very colorful moment in the narrative. But let me actually push back on some of the arguments that you made, because I think the effective attitude that you took as far as Crimea is concerned led to some, I would say, maybe a little biased conclusions as far as the relationship between Crimea and Ukraine. First thing I want to push back against is the argument that you describe Ukraine as an artificial entity formed by primarily foreign leaders. And that view, of course, has been expressed very often to deny legitimacy to the Ukrainian state by the Russian leaders, and it is used as a way of saying that basically the state, Ukrainian state, is a form of historical aberration. I would say that it overlooks the multiple number of times when Ukrainian leaders, not foreign leaders, but Ukrainian leaders, tried to establish their own state throughout the 20th century. It was the foreign leaders who actually intervened and prevented them from establishing their own state. That's point number one. And point number two, of course, is that, of course, the Ukrainian state in its current borders is the outcome of multiple historical contingencies, right? And of course, Lenin and Stalin and their decisions influenced the shape of today's Ukraine. But in that same manner, any state in the current international system is an outcome of these historical contingencies. It is artificial, and the current Russia in its borders is an artificial creation, and the United States is an artificial state as well. I live in Texas, and I know that there is nothing natural about Texas being part of the United States. It's not a natural preordained outcome. I'm not a Texas secessionist, but don't get me wrong. Another important point that you make, and it sort of struck me, I felt it was very unfair, you argued that Crimea was not part of any mental map of Ukrainians. You argued that there are all these diverse mental maps that Ukrainians have, and this is a very diverse society, but the Crimea never fits into any mental map. And, just two examples. You don't need to go too far and just travel to Khersones and go to the Vladimir's Cathedral, which was rebuilt with the support of the Ukrainian state, and of course the Christian tradition, the Christianity that is part of Ukrainian religious tradition. All of that comes from Saint Vladimir and the baptism of Saint Vladimir in Crimea. The second example is go to any Ukrainian national museum, and you will see multiple examples and exhibits of Scythian cultural artifacts. And Scythian cultural artifacts are viewed as part of Ukrainian cultural heritage. And of course, Scythians were the ones who lived in Crimea and in southern parts of Ukraine. So of course, it's part of the mental map of Ukrainians. And it has been consistently, by the way, stressed and emphasized in multiple political statements of Ukrainian leaders for whatever it's their worth, of course. The third important point I want to make is that you sometimes make an argument that Ukraine somehow discriminated Crimea, particularly economically. And you were making this point that the average salary of Crimeans was $300 per month versus the average salary of Ukrainians at some point was $700. So basically it was the Crimeans were getting half of what an average Ukrainian was getting. In fact, well, first of all, there was never a time, unfortunately, when an average Ukrainian was getting $700. The maximum we were getting was, I think, 2008, 2009, was about $400. And you would be surprised which of the regions actually had the lowest average income. That was Western Ukraine. And Ternopil, specifically, was the region, the oblast, with the lowest average income. It was not Crimea. I certainly agree with you that there was a lot of malpractice, economic mishandling of Crimea by the Ukrainian political elites, but you also make an interesting point, which I unfortunately also have to disagree with, about the reasons for peace in Ukraine. So there is this debate for, Ukraine was peaceful for 25 years and suddenly we have an outbreak of conflict in Donbass. What are the reasons? And your answer is the reason is we had a coup in Kiev, or a revolution, you say whatever your preference is, whatever you want to describe, that basically upended the balance that existed before that. And you credit the four presidents, Kravchuk, Kuchma, Yushchenko, and Yanukovych, for trying to maintain a peaceful balance and what you call balancing act between different parts of Ukraine. I emphatically disagree with that, and I actually think that it is in a way, Euromaidan was the accumulation of polarization, of regional polarization between Ukraine that was the result of intentional attempts by political elites like Yushchenko, like Yanukovych, to stress the significance of regional cleavages and to exploit these regional cleavages for the purposes of acquiring and maintaining political power. So in a way, Euromaidan was not something that came suddenly and upended the balance. The balance has been consistently attacked by very dishonest politicians who were unfortunately also happened to be leaders of the Ukrainian state. Now, one thing that is common both in the case of Gerard, in the book of Gerard, and in Constantine's book is this argument, which I think is crucially important, which is that ethnicity in Ukraine doesn't matter that much from the standpoint of analytical utility to explaining the outcomes. So ethnicity, whether you are ethnic Russian or ethnic Ukrainian, would not be able to help you to predict what would be your response to the annexation to Green Men in Crimea or to the appearance of insurgents in Donbass. This is exactly what I find in my own research in the surveys that I did in Donbass. One important finding that I identified was a majority of insurgents in Donbass were actually Ukrainian by nationality. They were identifying themselves as Ukrainian. The second important point was that in my service in Donbass, I noticed that ethnicity itself was not a predictor, or the use of language was not a predictor of people's attitudes towards the insurgents, the extent to which they sympathized with them. And your argument and Gerard's argument, of course, is based on a very rich empirical literature on Ukraine that developed in the 1990s and 2000s, which argued that what really predicts your attitudes and your political behavior is the region where you reside. So if you're ethnic Russian and you reside in Western Ukraine, you are more similar politically to ethnic Ukrainians. If you're ethnic Ukrainian and you reside in Donbass, you are more similar in your political attitudes and preferences to ethnic Russians. So region really is a very important variable in explaining outcomes in Ukraine. Now, as far as the differences are concerned, let me point to two important differences between Gerard and Constantine. On one hand, Gerard uses the argument of thick geopolitics, in which he emphasizes the role of marginalized localities. You emphasize the significance of paying attention to the dynamics on the local level. We should forget about, or we should study the interaction between the United States, Russia, and political elites, but we should also pay attention to who are the local strong men in Donbass, in Crimea, who are these criminals like Serhiy Kudelia, and what was his interest in this whole thing. So that was, I think, a very important argument that was coming very clearly from your book. Constantine, unfortunately, I think, focused primarily on the relationship between the West and the United States and Russia, and presented Euromaidan revolution specifically as this Western organized plot, the result of Western scheming between Victoria Nuland and a few other Western leaders. And you continuously ask this question in the book: what were they thinking? What were these Western leaders thinking when they organized this thing? Couldn't they foresee things in advance, what it would lead to? But I think more proper, and it's a very good question to ask, but we also have to ask a second question. Ask these people on Euromaidan, what are they thinking? What are the people who are using Molotov cocktails against the police? What are they thinking? How about people who are going and entering government buildings? What are their goals? And I think if you're just focusing on Victoria Nuland, she really, in my view, had very little to do with the dynamics of the Ukrainian revolution. Very little to do. Of course, it was important for Yatsenyuk, for Klitschko and Tahnebok that they had this international backing, but really for the regular protester on the ground, whether there was Nuland or there was no Nuland, it really had no significance. And finally, one important contrast I wanted to draw between the vision of the future. So we're all kind of wondering what's next, right? We have this problem in Donbass, we have a next Crimea. Where are we going to move next? And Constantine's answer is that the only way you can move somewhere for Ukraine is for Ukraine to really develop itself into a more wealthy, economically wealthy, politically advanced state, and that will somehow inspire, this is the scenario that you are painting, maybe inspire some of the Crimeans to look up to Ukraine and maybe consider joining Ukraine again. But, and this is one of the scenarios that you are presenting, but of course throughout the book you consistently stress that Ukraine is a failing state, that Ukraine's nation is very divided, that Ukraine basically is marred and sort of constrained by its inability to find consensus between political elites. And it seems like the scenario of Ukraine developing very quickly is more of a science fiction story than an actual realistic scenario that you are presenting. Gerard, by contrast, offers a different approach, an interesting approach, very, I think, polemical, which is he suggests that we have to rethink the sanctity of borders. He argues that, and he quotes George Kennan, that states and the shape of states is in constant dynamics. It changes all the time. So our, if to use the word fetish from Constantine's work, fetishization of the territorial integrity principle is basically a wrong way of thinking about it. That we should really accept, in a way, the fact that there may be different forms of sovereignty that Ukraine can exercise over Crimea and over over Donbass. But that, it's a very interesting idea, but that also presents a certain problem. And here I want to, Gerard, use your term again, effective geopolitics. You argue that Donbass and Crimea became the symbols of Russian power, right? But at the same time, they become very loaded in terms of effective response on the Ukrainian side. And they became a symbol for Ukraine of humiliation, of national humiliation, of national shame. Every time we look at Crimea and Donbass, we remember the moment of this utter weakness. We were unable to prevent this tragedy from happening. And that's why I think it's, again, using your framework, because of this effective response that the majority of Ukrainians have to Crimea and Donbass, it's very difficult to imagine that any Ukrainian politician, serious Ukrainian politician, would say the things that you just said. It's okay not to have Crimea for Ukraine. It's okay not to have Donbass for Ukraine. And if there is no politician or leader who would say these things, how will this enter, again using your terms, how will this enter our imagination? How can we as Ukrainians imagine Ukraine without Donetsk, Luhansk, Sevastopol, and Simferopol, and many other beautiful cities in these regions? How can we imagine that? And it seems like it's going to be a very difficult job for any political leader to sell this to the public that has been so much affected emotionally by the events that we saw. For that reason, I believe that on one hand, we're going to see continued revanchism, and this is your term, of Putin, revanchism in attempts to maintain the strength of the Russian state at the expense of the Ukrainian state. And we will also see the pressure on the part of many Ukrainians to achieve the revenge for the losses that we suffered in Crimea and in Donbass.
Thank you very much as well. As you see, and as I think is entirely appropriate for this topic, there is a lively discussion and also some disagreement, which means that I would think that our speakers would probably very much like to also respond to each other. I would like to ask you, as we said at the beginning, that you can absolutely do that. Please bring it into the discussion. But that at the same time we also open up already towards the audience so that, you know. How
much time do we have?
Oh, we have at least, if we want to, something like almost another hour. You know, I mean, I think we have some time to. No, we have some time to talk about these things, definitely. So I'm trying to keep lists of people who would like to ask questions. My request to you would be ask questions by any means, and complex ones, but preferably questions. Questions are best, so not little speeches, which we are always tempted to give. So who would like to actually go first, please?
Good evening, my name is Pavel. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. We're very nice to have you here at SIPA. I have two quick questions. The first one, kind of complement each other. The first question is, when was the last time you went to Crimea? And the second question is, could you please give us a comment, give your personal insight on position of the Russian government that is also kind of supported by my personal connection, that says that most of Crimeans that have never felt being part of Ukraine since 1991, and they wanted to have the autonomy of the past 20 years, and they use this conflict as a chance to finally perform what they always wanted to do, which was to rejoin with Russia. Do you agree with that or not?
And the question is addressed to...
Who would you like to?
If any of you would like to answer, like.
Well, my quick response would be, I haven't been to, last time I went to Crimea was in 1996, and I never went back, and I don't think I ever will. Unless, with the liberating NATO army, kind of, on the landing craft, kind of. Aircraft carrier, John McCain, that kind of thing. As for Crimeans, well, you know what? There's a huge intentional disconnect between Russian government and Crimeans. In the eyes of the Russian government, Russian media, and frankly, the majority of Russian people, I don't think, Crimeans, doesn't matter, Russian, Ukrainian, or Tatar, have an agency, right? They're practically, an object that has to be saved from bigger evil. So I don't think they're real in the eyes of the rest of Russia. I hope that answers your question.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment on this?
Well, I can comment on when I visited Crimea last time. I was for my honeymoon, which was a very nice occasion. So it was 2011. And I haven't been there since, but I've been there many times before 2011. I cannot say for sure that I know the preferences of Crimeans as far as Russia versus Ukraine is concerned. What I can say is, on one hand, I think Ukrainian state at some point managed successfully to quell attempts to separate Crimea in the 1990s. There were these movements for separation, for secession, that were addressed rather skillfully, I would say, by Leonid Kuchma. But I think the mistake that Kuchma made, and then Yushchenko made, and then, of course, Yanukovych made, was that they tried to quell Crimea by, on one hand, making certain concessions to the local elites, but at the same time imposing their own political elites, bringing their own sort of clients to control Crimea so that they would have a direct keep it at a very short leash, so to speak. They never managed to develop a local strong political elite that would have a stake in Ukrainian statehood. And because of that, I think when the Green Men arrived from Russia, they were surprised themselves, and a number of memoirs now show that they were surprised with the extent to which local elites, both in the law enforcement, Ukrainian guys with stars, right, and political elites were actually either passive or even welcoming their presence there. And I think this is the result of the inability to create a local elite that has a direct stake in maintaining the Ukrainian integrity of the Ukrainian state. There are, of course, big variation as far as geography of Crimea is concerned. I know that Sevastopol was consistently more pro-Russian, and when I was part of the Ukrainian government in 2008, 2009, I went on the government trip with a delegation to celebrate 225th anniversary of Sevastopol. That happened in June of 2008. And I remember when we were moving in our buses through Sevastopol, there were Russian flags all over. And members of the government were looking around and saying, where did we arrive? Is this Ukraine or is this Russia? So within the Ukrainian government, there was at that time clear sense that something is going wrong, at least in Sevastopol, right? But I think there was no attempt to really interfere in time. And of course, when Yanukovych comes in, he brings in the so-called Makedonцы, all people from Makeyevka, who start to run the show in Crimea, and that alienates the local elite even more, right? All right. I'll stop here.
Gerard, would you or?
Well, I would love to go to Crimea, but you need, as a young researcher, you need to know that if I go to Crimea through Moscow, I will be banned for going to Ukraine because research is criminalized there. I've run up against this issue with South Ossetia. I went to South Ossetia in March 2010 and was subsequently banned by the Georgian government from going to Georgia because of a law on occupied territories. So there are certain, you talk to the Ukrainian government and their particular policy is you need to get a visa, you need to get their permission, and then you need to go from Ukraine. But if you do that, then you're likely to be hostilely received by the local authorities in Crimea. So it's a place where it's very difficult to do research. There's an article that I would recommend by Carolina Di Stefano in the latest Russian Analytic Digest, which talks about these particular issues and the difficulty of doing research there, as well as how things are going quite badly in Crimea. On the second part of it, I was fortunate to have some funds from the National Science Foundation to do a public opinion survey in December of 2014, and that survey demonstrated that the majority sentiment was in favor of the annexation. I would love to be able to do that research again, but I don't think that that's possible. I don't think it is. Because of how politicized this is, that we'd be able to get a strong measure of the sentiment and how that sentiment has changed. So doing research on these places is difficult. It's similarly, if you go to Nagorno-Karabakh, you're banned from going to Azerbaijan, and so on and so forth. And so for a researcher, part of the issue is the state will trap you into their particular narrative, and then the other state, I think, counter to, you can understand why they would want to sort of criminalize it, but it's also counterproductive because effectively they're alienating researchers, and researchers just get one point of view and not other balanced.
Well, may I invite further questions? Nobody? Oh, please.
So I guess with the near abroad and going back to the fear from Russia, the practical fear of NATO expansion and its doorstep, having NATO walk straight up to it. How do you explain the Baltics, or do you explain that as that was the tripwire that really scared Putin? But 2002, their map agreement to 2004 actual entry into NATO, there wasn't a concerted large effort to stop them from Russia as much as any of the Georgia or the Ukraine, or if anybody else tried it from here on out, it seems like.
That's a very good question. In the book, what I do is I point out the inadequacy of the argument by Mersheimer that NATO expansion is the cause of Putin acting the way he did in 2014, and the West is to blame. That sort of famous or infamous article in Foreign Affairs. And I have quotes in there from Putin saying that Ukraine's relationship, when Kuchma was in power, Ukraine's relationship with NATO is a matter for Ukraine and NATO. So he was fine with that. That was part of what was articulated at that particular time. Also, after the Georgian War, he was interviewed on German television about Crimea and asked about that. And he said, quote, "Crimea is not a contested territory." Okay, so this is contingent. Its circumstances change, and so that's why I have a discussion of eventful processes and what eventful processes are, and which is where things change in part because Putin was coming back in power in 2011 and tilting in a more conservative direction, and just to sort of nuance some of the argument that Serhiy made about security concerns, there's also a personalized dimension to this, and that was Putin was personally invested in Ukraine, was embarrassed by what had happened in 2004, and here it was happening to him again, where Yanukovych was being overthrown, and so there was a sort of a dimension there. There was also the hostility to perceived Western sponsorship of the Botnaya protests in December of 2011, and so that, which was a sort of a geopoliticization of protests which had an organic local quality to them, meant that he was reading things in a thin geopolitical way, which is that the West is behind all of these things that are happening. And so it is in part a personal story because power is concentrated in Putin's hands. He was the decider in the room when that decision was made on, what was it, May 20th, or February 20th of 2014. And so that, I think, is part of what we need to take into consideration. It's not simply, well, NATO was on our border. NATO always had a kind of, was close to Russia's borders. In Turkey, in Norway, in the Baltic states, and so on and so forth. Now, the Baltic states, in terms of a geopolitical imagination in Russian geopolitical culture, are often seen as not part of the Ruski Mir. But again, there's others that disagree with that, and it depends on whether you define Ruski Mir in terms of, in fully ethnic terms, or if you've got a kind of a different understanding of it.
Speaking of which, I have a question to Serhiy. You used the term, nationality so seriously, kind of freaked me out. No, nationality. Citizenship, I understand. Dual citizenship, I don't like, but I understand that, right? Mother tongue, I understand. Nationality, I don't. And Russian or Ukrainian could be a good case study, right? But seriously, what do you mean by nationality?
That's good. That's a good question.
What
do people mean when they being asked what is your nationality, and they say I'm Russian or Ukrainian? What does that statement mean to them?
Possibly they are too busy to be talking to the interviewer, so they want.
No, this is not interviewer. This is
This is a basic question.
This
is a basic question.
Yes. This is the Ukrainian police. I was quoting the court cases of the insurgents who were asked the question, what is your nationality? These are people who spent some time fighting for Donbass to secede from Ukraine. And when they're being asked, what is your nationality? They're saying, I'm Ukrainian. What does that mean? Well, it means to me that nationality really doesn't matter as far as your political choosing. That's what I was trying to say.
Yes, please.
This is a perfect segue into the question that I have, but I was just wondering, you commented on the significance of regional ties rather than ethnicity or perhaps nationality in this case. And I was just wondering if you could speak to who you think the separatists are and who are their sympathizers.
Are you...
Anyone is free to answer.
Separatists where?
In Donbass or Crimea.
That's very different because, in Crimea you had that direct interference of Moscow from the start. For many years, Moscow had been, actually training paramilitary militias in Crimea, so it's a complicated story. In Donbass also, Moscow was there, but they were in a rush. So my impression is that, what you have got in Donbass was a combination, separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk, was a combination of professional criminals, seriously, felons, opportunists, local shady, shadow economy lords, right? And I don't think, they had any real ideology back then. Now, almost 4 years later, well, I am not sure about ideology or ideas, but they are becoming a more consolidated, not group, but conglomerate of groups or gangs, call them whatever you want.
May I perhaps suggest, I'm sure Serhiy would also like to say something, and maybe Gerard, because after all, half of your book at least is actually not about Ukraine, but about the interaction between Georgia and other entities, as it were, in Russia. Maybe you could offer us a sort of how this fits into a broader framework. Maybe Serhiy.
Yeah. So the poll, the survey that I did in 2015, so it was right a year after these events, in the towns that were liberated by the Ukrainian government, and they were controlled by the Ukrainian government at that time when we were doing the survey. And we were asking some of the questions indirectly about theirs. So we're not asking them specifically whether they support insurgents or not, but we were asking, well, what is your general attitude in your family? How did they respond to the insurgents? Or what was the level of support for insurgents at the beginning of the insurgency, at the end of the insurgency? We were also asking questions about the level of victimization. Were you fearful of insurgents when you encountered them? How many civilians do you know insurgents have killed? So all these multiple questions, and what we found was that people who identified themselves with the region, with Donbass, who said, when some of the initial questions were, please tell me what is your main identity, whether you identify yourself as a Ukrainian, a citizen of Ukraine, a citizen, resident of the town where you live, a resident of Donbass, ethnic Russian, Soviet person, etc., multiple options. And what we found was that those who identified themselves with Ukraine or were saying Ukrainian citizens, they consistently, and that had very significant statistical significance. Those identifying with Ukraine were consistently saying that the level of support in their towns was very low, that insurgents were killing a lot of civilians, and that they were personally very fearful when they're encountering them on the streets. By contrast, those, and there were about 40%, close to 50% of those who identified themselves primarily with Donbass or Toal, were consistently saying there were no civilians killed. We felt no fear when we were encountering insurgents on the streets. The support for insurgents was very high at the beginning of the insurgency, which for me, basically, and this is part of our argument in the article, is that there have been these pre-existing regional identities or identity in Donbass that then affected the attitudes, political attitudes towards the insurgency because of the rising saliency of the region, specifically of Donbass, as a result of Euromaidan. So Euromaidan, our argument was that Euromaidan's revolution raised the salience of the regional cleavages and differences. Of course, it was amplified by the Russian media, by all that political elites have been saying in the region, etc. And that determined or influenced significantly the level of public civilian support in Donbass. And that's why you did not have such a high level of support in Odessa for separatism or in Kharkiv, because it really is something about the region of Donbass and the way people identify themselves with that region. As far as the composition of insurgents, there have been no, from what I know, I understand, no scientific studies done of the composition. My hunch is, from reading over 800 of these criminal court cases, that partially what Constantine says is true, that there have been criminal elements, but out of all the people who were captured by Ukrainians, insurgents that are spending time in prison right now, or have been spending some time in prison. Only about 10-15% of people had criminal records. The rest had no criminal record, which for me says that this was not how Ukraine liked to depict that these were all criminals and drunkards and drug addicts, right? This was the initial stigmatization of the insurgent movement by these three groups, and these guys had majority had clear records. As far as their professional background is concerned, it varies significantly, but there has been, about 25%, I think, were related to the industries there, various types of industries, but these were not the majority workers. So the composition was very diverse. You had people from political parties, from communists specifically, and the Party of Regions. You had people from the administration or some law enforcement personnel. So the composition was very diverse.
May I very quickly add a very simple question because it's so curious. Do you have data on the level of education in formal times?
Yes. The level of education was higher. Education was about 30%, if I'm not mistaken. The majority had technical education, PTU. That was about plurality. That was about 45%. And then there were about 20-25% students or people who had only high school education.
Would you like to?
Yeah, so to just kind of broaden the picture, one of the things that my colleague, Dr. John O'Loughlin, and I have done is surveys in the de facto states over the last, I guess, decade. And the de facto states, the four post-Soviet de facto states, I'm talking about Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, and Nagorno-Karabakh. One of the things that you find, Nagorno-Karabakh is obviously somewhat different because there you, the kind of the major parent state is Azerbaijan and Armenia, and so Russia is a kind of a third party in that conflict rather than. But if you look at Abkhazia, you look at South Ossetia, Transnistria, very strong sentiment about the collapse of the Soviet Union. That the Soviet Union's collapse was, we had this right step, wrong step question. And majority sentiment is that it's the wrong step. So that is quote-unquote Soviet nostalgia. Very, very strong in these areas. And so one of the things that one needs to grasp is that that was a disaster, or the people in those areas who had some form of local autonomy. The case of Transnistria is a little bit different, but they leveraged that form of local autonomy in order to secede from the nationalizing state, the independent post-Soviet state, in the case of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, clearly, and then also there was a creation of a state in Transnistria based upon old historical divides, although it doesn't quite track the border, the Dniester River there. But the sentiment is one which is very pro-Russian, and it is generally Soviet nostalgic. So that is quite different from the nationalizing state, but not completely different. And so that's an important finding. I think that the case of separatism in the Donbass is one that we really are still trying to grapple with, and Serhiy is on the front line of doing research on that, and it is a kind of a fascinating one. What I would say is that the particular frames that are used to debate it, which is this is a civil war, as opposed to this is aggression by Russia, are both inadequate because it's a combination of both. This is something that certainly was, and that's the argument that I make in Near Abroad, is that certainly you can see it, the kind of violent nature of the conflict being ignited by Gherkin and by the particular forces that went from Crimea to the Donbass. but it is naive to assume that absent that, there wouldn't have been some kind of major divide or major rupture. It was very, very problematic. The anti-Maidan movement was throughout Ukraine, but was particularly concentrated in the Donbass. And so regional identity is really, really important. But in the surveys that we have done in East Ukraine, a predictor of, and you can see it, if someone says they're ethnic Russian, they're generally likely to have attitudes which are distinctive from those who say that they're ethnic Ukrainian. Which is not to say that that the people that say that they're ethnic Russian are necessarily homogenous. They're not. But you will notice that in Kharkiv and Odessa, there is greater support, and this is in the book, for Novorossiya and the particular idea of Novorossiya. So it's not a case that the country really consolidated around an anti-Putin kind of policy. There was significant sentiment, minority sentiment, sure, but significant in southeast Ukraine, which was supportive of Russia. And I would bet it's still there. One of the things that I'm currently doing research on is comparing a survey which was conducted in April of 2014, which was in 8 oblasts of southeast Ukraine, with the survey that we did, which was in 6 oblasts. We couldn't survey in Donetsk and Luhansk because of the war, and whether attitudes had changed or not. And what you find is that attitudes have hardened, but they haven't changed that much. There was a kind of a divide already, and it hardened a bit. And then the other question, which gets at research for those of you who are thinking about doing research and survey research, the do not knows, refuse to say, is something that we really need to find out more about, because there are a number of people who will not say because they do not trust the person who's doing the survey. There's a difference. Without getting too detailed about it, the survey in March was both phone and face-to-face. And there's a significant difference between whether it was phone or face-to-face. You can see that in the particular survey results. So one of the things that's exciting, those of you who are kind of going into survey research, is the new methods that are being used, the experimental methods, and then also tablets, and then the ability of people to do kind of instant work on tablets, because that sort of changes the dynamic. There's problems with that, but that's really kind of a fascinating thing to do research on.
I have 2 more questions lined up. First, Professor Giuliani, and then Giuliano, and then Ambassador Kuchitsky after, please.
Thank you for a great panel. Very interesting, and I really recommend. I haven't read your book, but so I cannot recommend it. But it sounds quite interesting, and I really recommend Gerard's book. There's so much in there that wasn't even covered tonight, but I'm glad you just mentioned the last part of it. And I guess I have a question building on this point about that is in line with Serhiy Kudelia's findings from the survey, which I can't wait to read about regional identity being exacerbated by Euromaidan, raising the sense of regional identities, and then that leading to greater support for the insurgency. So I guess I kind of wanted to ask you about, well, I'm also researching popular attitudes in East Ukraine, and I guess, although the regions are quite different, and I think there's a lot that can be said about the different regions and their different attitudes, but you do hear again and again this kind of sense of abandonment that people articulated even during Maidan and continue to articulate or use that word. We're abandoned by the regime, we're abandoned by Kiev, we're abandoned by our countrymen. And it's, well, unpacking that is very important. As you said, we don't know enough yet. But there's definitely the kind of like feeling of echo of Orange Revolution, or people who felt that they were left behind by Orange Revolution. And I guess my question is not so much about the attitudes, which I think we do need to work on more to understand, but what is the reaction of Poroshenko or the government? And building on the very interesting point that Serhiy made earlier, that 25 years of peace was not disrupted by Maidan, but was a result of the of presidents trying to divide the population and play on these regional differences. So now, what do you see any kind of recognition or repeat of that fact by Poroshenko? Because it seems to me like there's very little recognition of the fact that, as Gerard was just saying, that there is this kind of large set of people out there that are not really okay with the revolution of dignity, or they're still sympathetic to Russia for various reasons, or maybe, definitely many of people have switched to a more anti-Russian position, but still there are these large parts of the Ukrainian population in the East and South who are not really on board with the overall program of integrating with Europe. And I just wanted to ask about how you interpret the response of the government to they don't, I'm not following as closely as perhaps you have been following it. Do they listen to them? Do they make any kind of policy to reach them? It seems to me that they make no policy to reach and shape attitudes in Donbass, in occupied Donbass. So I'm just wondering what is the Poroshenko government really constrained by this, or is it something that they're just trying to ignore and hope it goes away? So what does it kind of mean for the current state of high politics?
I can't answer the situation in the ground. I cannot answer that, but I can give you what I think is. I can articulate a concern that I have about what I see when I encounter Ukrainian officials in Washington, D.C. And that is that there's a crusade going on right now, and the Ukrainian government is very much into that crusade and is kind of pushing that and feels affirmed by the whole scandal over Russian interference and in the election and Russian information warfare, and as a consequence is not attentive to precisely those things that you're talking about. The majority of the population, when we served in Southeast Ukraine, did not want to be members of NATO. But you cannot say that, or the Ukrainian government is not saying that. And unfortunately, I think the U.S. government, or certain officials in the U.S. government, are still sort of beating on the NATO drum about, we need to get Ukraine in. And that is, I think, deepening the problem, because you're further polarizing a population that really needs to have a space which is sort of neutral or outside of that. Whether that is realistic or not is another matter. But just analytically, it seems to me that that's part of the problem. And just kind of pulling back a little bit further, Georgia and Ukraine going towards NATO, what was different about them? Well, those two countries had regions which had regions which were the opposite, where there was strong organized opposition against NATO membership, and so that was an available resource for Russia to use, a lever to use, and it was used, so in effect, by pursuing that, the countries led to a polarization, and as you know, that the numbers, the kind of public opinion polling on Ukraine in NATO when they went for that in 2008 was extremely low. There was like 30% or so support nationally, but the assumption was that we can change that because we changed it amongst folks in NATO, because we changed it in the Czech Republic and elsewhere, that was something that could be manufactured. A big mistake. And why they do that, why the particular elites do that, Well, of course, NATO and the US is an instrument in which they can further their own particular ends locally, and by ingratiating themselves and creating an alliance with Western partners. So that's the kind of view that I would have from Washington, or particular analysis of it.
Constantine, Serhiy.
Well, just the NATO thing, that's when that interesting idea of eastward expansion of the alliance became serious in the mid-1990s, George Kennan briefly came out of retirement and gave a series of interviews and talks. He said that, when you start expanding to the east, and I quote, I think, very close to the text, he said, the United States is making a strategic blunder of potentially epic proportions. Well, for a number of reasons, and actually at that point, the leading Pentagon, brass, they were against that. How Clinton administration prevailed is a different story. Just two things, right? First, well, the Baltics, the Czech Republic, that's passé, that's a different story in any case. Ukraine is a country with a very substantial territory. It's roughly the size of Texas, right? Well, pun not intended, I'm sorry, okay. The perimeter of its borders with Russia, Russia's ally, Belarus, and the coast of the Black Sea, all in all, that's longer than 2,000 miles. So how on earth did anyone in NATO even thought about possibly defending that country against Russia? That's just militarily not doable. So from the start, that was an interesting concept. Furthermore, the most interesting part about NATO and NATO expansion, well, after all, we possibly shouldn't be, well, we can afford to not be losing sleep over NATO membership of Estonia or Latvia, right? Those two countries have substantial Russian minorities, between 25 and 30% according to different estimates, and Russian speakers, whatever, live in compact areas there. Theoretically, it's not impossible that Mr. Putin will one day, or his successors will one day, try, starting trouble there, in Estonia or in Latvia. Luckily for us, the people who wrote the NATO Charter in 1949, they were very bright fellows. The Article 5, quoted so often, right? Article 5 of NATO, one for all and all for one? Yeah, kinda. Well, sure, an attack on one member of the alliance is an attack on the alliance as a whole. And after that, each NATO country should assist the attacked party by any means it will choose to use. So let's say, if a NATO country is attacked by Russia or whatever, well, the United States might choose to send, well, a symbolic, number of troops. France may choose to send flowers. And technically it will not be violating Article 5 of NATO. So yes, NATO expansion is a dangerous thing and was a blunder of strategic proportion, but things are not as bleak as they look. I mean, for the United States, the West, and so Third World War, well, even if Putin does something else, we don't have to start the Third World War over that.
Yeah, very shortly. So, at least the sense of abandonment is not felt only by the people in southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. It's felt by the people who won in the revolution, right? So everyone is feel abandoned now by Poroshenko and Groisman. You just look at their ratings, you just look at their level of popularity, and look what's happening now in Kiev these days. So, of course, there is, unfortunately, the tendency of the authorities, particularly Poroshenko, to move further to the right than any of his predecessors, even Mr. Yushchenko, and the educational law that has been recently adopted, which is now at the center of attention, and conflict with the European Union, right, is the best illustration. There was no point in doing what they did in terms of abolishing Russian language schools. Why? Because 90% of schools in Ukraine are Ukrainian language schools. There are only 10% of Russian language schools. And if Mr. Poroshenko read Gerard's book, he would find out that Russian language has there's no correlation between the use of the Russian language and support or no support for Putin. Right? So language by itself does not influence political behavior and political choices. But the policies that he adopted panders to Western Ukraine. It's clear attempt to concentrate his or consolidate his support there and make sure that he has a chance of being reelected in 2000 and whatever year that would be, 19, I suppose. So I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think they're making they're drawing the right lessons. And of course, with these kinds of policies, and this is just one example, when people in Crimea and in the rebel-controlled Donbass, when they're seeing these changes, of course, that does not make them more sympathetic towards Ukraine or more excited about being part of Ukraine. So, unfortunately, the rhetoric is about building a civic nation. If you hear Poroshenko, he emphasizes the inclusivity part. But de facto, in reality, in substance, what they're doing is really more of an ethnic component to many of his policies.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me thank the presenters yours was very vivid, passionate presentation. I have a question, direct question to Constantine. As you are well aware, there were attempts at separatism in Ukraine during the 26 years. There were several attempts. One in 2004 during the Orange Revolution, in 1993 in Crimea, well mentioned. Don't you think that if it were not for a little help from Russia to the separatists, thoughts and intentions in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, it would not have succeeded, number one. Because it seems that Mr. Putin, inspired by this successful story in Crimea, that annexing the peninsula without a shot fired, so there was this mood, as you were speaking about Mr. Putin's mood. There was this feeling that it will go that easily, and that's why, from the very beginning, it seems to me, and I'm asking you, what is your attitude? There was direct involvement of Russian military in eastern Ukraine, in April, of Russian FSB and the military intelligence. So what would be your comments on that? And number two, as we're well aware, there is no subjunctive mood in history, but we are all aware that President Yanukovych, till September 2013, was declaring the support for association agreement, to the extent that there was a government decree, back in September 2013, that we are going to join the association agreement, right? And then there was a turnaround and a change. To the extent that the opposition at the time of Yanukovych inside, Yatsenyuk and all other people, were saying that once he signs the agreement, that will take the carpet from the opposition. What will we do? So, my question would be to you, What if he signed the agreement? What would be the Russian reaction, President Putin's reaction? Thank you.
Wonderful questions. Number one, I completely agree with you. I'm sure that that somehow, Putin's people were in Donbass from the start. I'm sure that they had been there even before April 2014. Laying down, the network, and absolutely. My impression is also from the start, Putin knew that his involvement in Donbass would be very different from Crimea. Crimea, he was thinking annexation there, and Russia easily bought that. I think what he needed in Donbass was a long-lasting, factor of destabilization of Ukraine, right? And I'm sure that for the past 3 years and a half, that's what his people have been doing there. Keep it simmering, keep Ukraine under immense stress. So, and I totally agree with you, well, okay, we will possibly never know whether Putin had a plan like 2 years before that, right? Maybe yes, maybe no. But definitely, his role in April 2014 was overwhelmingly important. As for Yanukovych and signing the agreement, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, the major protests in Kiev did not start after Yanukovych refused to sign it, right?
Not immediately after.
Huh?
When it became, well, the first gatherings started of students when there was announced that he is not going to sign it.
Yes.
Early in November.
Yeah.
But then when he refused, then people went to Maidan.
Yeah. Well, exactly, is there such a thing as an if in history? But, frankly, I would not exclude that, had Yanukovych been stronger or just smarter and signed the agreement as it was, maybe Putin wouldn't have reacted that strong. Maybe yes, maybe not.
Maybe he would have been declared a CIA agent, and because the idea of finishing it up and destabilizing Ukraine has been there in his mind for a long time, as you rightly mentioned. So it's just, it doesn't matter whether he signed it or not. The main idea is to punish Ukraine for that and to keep it destabilized. That's the idea.
You're absolutely right, but Putin is also human, and he's losing his instincts. Seriously, his political instincts. I think he used to be, well, he always was a thug, right? But that
to put it mildly.
Yeah, sure. But that does not mean that he was not a very gifted politician. But in the past few years, he is, too long in the Kremlin. So, so maybe, as you're saying, he would have stepped in any case. Maybe.
Thank you.
I think we've really taken a lot out of our panelists.
I think we didn't mention one significant factor, guys. I'm sorry. Economy. Like our former president said, it's the economy stupid. I know for the fact that a lot of pensioners in Crimea, for example, thought they're going to get bigger pensions if they joined Russia. So there was a lot of, people in Donbass were under the illusion that maybe they'll join Russia and they'll a lot better off. I mean, can anybody comment on the significance of economic factors in the region?
I would suggest, let's make that our last question, which is a good wrap-up question. And Gerard, I think you were...
Yes, so I wanted to make 2 points in conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take that first. And that is that part of the argument of the book against thin geopolitics is the way in which we gravitate towards the larger geopolitical picture. So we spent a lot of time talking about NATO. And I hope one of the points that has come out of our discussion is that NATO and NATO membership actually doesn't affect the daily lives of people that much at all. But it's a resource which is available for elites to mobilize opinion, internationally. And it's a symbolic issue. But what's neglected? It's the economy, it's the poor health care, it's human security writ large. And it's those particular factors which get left behind when we like geopolitics. A lot of people, internationally, they like to talk about it, like to argue about it. But a lot of people in Crimea and in southeast Ukraine and in the Donbass have the same damn problems of corruption, of poor healthcare, very poor healthcare, of education, which is not necessarily preparing their kids for for improving, for human flourishing. And so that's the cost, I think, of this sort of geopoliticization. And I think it's a serious one. Second comment is to push back a little bit against Serhiy, where he said about where you took an argument that I was making, which was more descriptive, and you made it normative. We have to rethink the sanctity of borders. That's not my argument per se. What I'm saying is, empirically, looking at the world political map, all states are, I don't use I don't like the term artificial, because the other of that is natural, and that in and of itself that's the language of nationalists, right? But all states are kind of territorially put together in contingent ways, and they are often kind of weak and unstable, and there will be change in the world political map. We see it with Catalonia, we see it with Kurdistan, we may see it in Bosnia, and so on and so forth. That's an empirical fact. So how do we deal with that as an international community? And what I would submit to you is what happened in Kosovo, in allowing Kosovo to become independent, was actually a good outcome, a reasonably good outcome. And that we have to, in certain circumstances, be able to and willing to consider a remedial secession as something which is at least worthy of discussion. And we cannot have borders be the be-all and end-all when they do not serve the human security interests of the people that are on the ground. So that's the kind of pushing back on that argument I was trying to make in the end. So.
If there's, is that
I think I'm kind of skeptical about the economic explanation. Primarily because what I mentioned is that the poorest regions in Ukraine were actually concentrated in the West. And if the decisive factor was the size of your pension or the size of the salary, I think a much larger movement would have been in support of Russian separation. So it may have been there as...
But you have to couple it to susceptibility. Those were Russians, and the western part were Ukrainians, so they didn't really have a chance. It was more these guys did. Right, so you can't just isolate this factor or that factor. You have to couple them together.
Now you're adding additional factors. All right.
No, but it's the interaction. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
So I think
20 seconds, may I really apologize that we did not bring up Crimean Tatars.
Yeah.
Right, it's just it's a shame. My fault. I'm sorry.
On this somber note,
Yes.
I'm sure there are many other things that we have not brought up, but I would still like to thank our speakers and also the audience for bringing up so many things in a very stimulating way.